Me and my sister, a mom and a dad. We were the perfect nuclear family growing up in the 1940s. This is a panoramic photograph. It's made at the military training base, Plattsburgh, New York, Company 3, Northeast Division. And it's probably around 1917. This is my father, probably 18 years old or something. And he eventually flew airplanes in World War I in Italy. But I was born in Detroit, Michigan. And my parents, at a point when I was pretty young, moved out to a suburb, Birmingham. On 15 Mile Road, in fact, so it's 15 miles north of Detroit. I went to elementary school there, a little teeny school, Bloomfield Village. And I went to Birmingham Junior High, and then I went to Cranbrook in high school. My mother had been a teacher of Latin. My father he was an engineer. He sold equipment to try to silence things. He hated noise. And so there's a whole range of silencers that he was involved with. In his later life, they were these big rooms to try to quiet industrial spaces. This is over at Henderson Harbor. It's a conclave in a cove that goes back several generations. My great-grandfather used to take his family there to tent in the 1880s. The 1920s, all of that farmland got broken into small lots. My grandmother and her husband, they bought one of those lots, and she built a house that's sort of a big camp. When my mom finally got married, which was quite late, my grandmother turned the garage into the cabin that my sister and I grew up in. So when I was growing up, in the summers, we would spend time on Lake Ontario, and I'd go back to that place continuously. 77th year of going there this year. You've created a story. It's a linear story. It makes my work and my life look incredibly coherent. And that's the job of a biographer, I think, in many ways. And there are actually little vignettes that are orphans, that don't connect to anything, that all of us have in our lives. For me, it was like remembering lying under the Christmas tree at the house in Birmingham, listening to Christmas music, while my mother was in the kitchen cooking and talking to a friend or something. Now, that doesn't connect to anything. But in many ways, it's the orphan events that are the most powerful because they don't connect, that emotionally they take us somewhere. And that's a little trickier. This is the original quote from the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. For our house is open. There are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will. He was commenting on how you really need poetry if you're going to try to acknowledge the fact that people's identities are as complex as they are. And that a person's life, like a house with unlocked doors, you have people passing through it, moving in and out of it. What he was talking about is how hard it is to have an identity. That's because every relationship that we have, we modify who we are to adapt to the person that we are relating to. If you're 70 years old, that's a very tall building with a lot of doors. The whole department kind of had this energy of feeding off of each other. There was a lot of collaboration. I believe the decision was made. We're not just going to go into a highfalutin gallery and show our precious artwork. We made an event of the opening. And I remember people crawling around in this thing that Ed had built. It's plastic with a fan. So it was like a tube that you could crawl in. It was not an appropriately serious show by any of us. I followed Frank Hewitt to the corners of the county. He collected snow and dirt for paintings. I photographed him there. And I did some stuff with glass. For some reason, we decided to invite people that don't usually go to the university. And I remember Bill Davison and I going around putting posters in snowmobile shops. there was an awful lot of drinking, and I think we got fairly not invited back to Middlebury.
Well, it sounds like that there was sort of a brotherhood.
It was a male-dominated department at that time, for sure. It is kind of a brotherhood.
Do you remember Arthur Norcross? He owned that lot, which is actually where Ben and Jerry's started. You know, we used to be a Mobiles.
I do. Yeah.
And above it was a billboard. It was left over from after the billboards were banned in Vermont.
Bill negotiated a billboard for the art department. And then we took turns putting art up on the billboard.
I had my class do an enlarged version of, there's a very famous thing of Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel, where the two fingers are touching.
Yes.
Oh, I did one that was the Vermont seal, it was during the Vietnam War. It was the warplanes flying over.
Frank Hewitt did Sunset Over the Waterfront, because that was a huge thing that was going on, the redevelopment of the waterfront or not.
It was like get into the community.
This project called Art in Public Places, funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. NEA gave the state of Vermont considerable money to produce these posters for public places. John Ingalls and I ran the project, and we paired up 10 poets with 10 artists. And we made these posters, and then the idea was that they would go all over the state, but not into museums or art galleries. They would go to bus stops. Dan collaborated with David Huddle. The first thing they did, and David wrote his poem on the urinal, and Dan took a photograph of it. Well, someone came up from Washington, D.C. to check out on the project, and they saw this poster and went ballistic. Said, no, you can't do this. So then Dan did another poster, which was Jane, I think she was nude, flailing around in a pile of leaves on top of Tower Mountain.
There was much more of a sense of play, that the art was kind of how you played. And I had trouble with the UVM art department, with whether what I was doing was legitimate. It was always very hard for them with, not the art department, but the deans and the next levels up, to know how to evaluate how good someone's art was. They say, well, we don't know anything about art, but this looks like a more serious venue. Like if you had a show in New York City, it's higher, you get more points than a show in Winooski, for example. But there were some very important people, A.D. Coleman, Lucy Lepard, that were really into, she was using my stuff in her books. And so I kind of had a outside backup team that helped get over some of those humps. It was, what you're doing isn't really art, and where you're showing isn't really important. I mean, those are things I came up against.
I had about 2 years of psychology under my belt when I started taking art courses, and it pretty much changed my trajectory. At that time, a lot of the teachers, professors there were just really, really good people.
Yeah, Dan is, he's unique, and I was just great, he was a great colleague to work with. A lot of students just adored him.
He was very good about dealing with kids my age, which we weren't all that much younger than he was, but he was very good about breaking apart your assumptions. And for me, he really enriched my value system.
He was a great teacher, and it's funny because he's so quiet and reserved and always more the observer. But when he teaches and when he talks, he's brilliant, articulate, can hold the stage, and you sort of don't expect it. I'm lucky that I have some photographs he's taken of my life over the years. This is this welded dress that I grew vines in. This would have been so boring for him. He would I'd be saying, Dan, I have to take slides of my work and they didn't come out well. What did I do wrong? And, he'd help me.
When we now talk about 3 TV channels in Puerto Cabezas, and we have all these young people to us now, 20, 25, learning to do interview for TV, doing edition, producing documentaries. The majority doesn't know that we have all this because at the beginning, there was a Dan Higgins dreaming about how to use video, teaching people to use video to register these momentos. Having Dan and Jane pacing Bilwi, Puerto Cabezas Street, certain part of the year at the beginning is part of our regular knowledge now in town. So when you saw them, you said, oh, a year went by. They're part of our community. We miss them when they are not here.
I can see the footprints on the backdrop paper. I was lying on the floor with some of the body parts that I cast, and he was making arrangements.
Dan had just started doing the Photo Lounge Halloween series. Of course, we jumped right on the bandwagon because we wanted to be cool like all the artists. Everyone was coming in from all over, so the creativity was really flowing. Dan's always been game for, chronicling what's happening in the moment in sneakers or in Winooski or in the world, basically.
John, when he ran sneakers, he every year used to want to have a community photograph made. And he would tell his customers to come in at 4 o'clock on a certain afternoon. He would put them on a bus and drive them somewhere sometimes. And I would make a photograph.
There are pictures of a party. Dan, Frank, Ernst, Jane, Betsy, and Nick. Barbara Zucker and Nanny. Oh, and Cheryl's there, and Rick Musty. And this is me.
We used to have a crescent moon set up here, that sort of nostalgia.
The penny postcard that you could mail became legal. I think it was the 1890s. The moon was one that's very well known, that you could sit on. And so this was, I think, 1991. It was one of those invasions of Iraq. It was a response to all that negativity that was going on. So yeah, so the moon was built here with clouds. And you, I know, came in for more than one picture. There's one of you and Blake, the theater.
I didn't realize it was just for a year.
Yeah, it was a one-time kind of fun thing to do. Peter Clavel, whose nickname is Moon, sitting on it with some people from Yaroslavl. It's a reference to many of those old photo studios, where the photo studio was the place where people went to have an image made. And there was a storyline that you fell into. And this was going to the moon. The 12 Days of Christmas was a response to the fact that the downtown Winooski that I had come to know and love had become very fragmented. My friend Earl, anthropologist, used to come out for the 12 Days of Christmas every year, and we would try to create some interesting trouble. So it was a project to take categories that were important to Winooski. So I didn't have turtle doves. I had coffee servers. Papa Frank came up with a huge pot of tomato sauce from his Italian restaurant. I had Leaping Lords, and I was able to go find generally elderly people from very different walks of life, shoot them by themselves, and then combine them. I got Senator Niket, who was way beyond leaping.
It was an attempt to go back into this community and look for people that I'd kind of lost because they were isolated. And it was an attempt, at least photographically, to create a sense of the whole community.
The Free Press runs a big story on it. So suddenly you had people making connections, which is what I wanted all along. A lot of these older guys, you know, they were living alone. And when the Free Press article hit, people started contacting them, which was great. And I said, God, I didn't know you were still alive. But it was so much fun getting people in here.
In 1993, you were given a key to the city of Winooski. What prompted that?
Well, I would imagine the Free Press article. Suddenly, the Free Press acknowledges something about Winooski that's positive. And so, yeah, Winooski was desperate for positive stories.
Dan, can you come up here? I'd like to present you, on behalf of the mayor and city council, the key to the city of Winooski, and thank you very much for your work you've done here in town.
Extraordinary. Key to a city.
It opens doors, locks.
These were the kinds of things that I was doing as part of a BCA print project. They would ask artists to make prints down there in the print shop. In my mind, they were environmental. In fact, this one's called Acid Rain Death Dance. So I've got the little death guys cleaning up in the fish. I was always supportive of the progressives running locally. And so I did a number of posters supporting Bernie when he was running for mayor. This one is talking about the mad brute, big business. This was when he was running for Congress. They're political, and they're fun to do. They're collages. This is Peter Clavel. He'd lost an election, and he was coming back for revenge. Look at the heads. La Revanche. After a trip to Managua that I went on with a group of artists, Lauren Glendavidian was on the group, Jane was. There's a number of people in support of the revolution. You know who was on that trip? He got in trouble for writing the thing about Muhammad.
Salman Rushdie?
Yep. And he wrote a book about that trip. That is where I collected a lot of the material from the streets that later ended up in those codalists at the Francis Coburn show. That work portrayed a very black and white picture of an aggressive United States government trying to destroy a revolution. It's accurate. The United States is an aggressive government. I kind of became an artist, if I'm an artist, during the Vietnam War. I didn't know any Vietnamese. I just knew Vietnam. It was an abstraction. The same with Nicaragua. When the revolution happened, it was an abstraction, and this is propaganda. And it's different than using a camera to try to understand what actually is going on in a social situation. Making a movie, there's an assumption that life goes in a straight line. And as you know, my life jumps all around all over the place. So I can imagine you're going to have a little bit of problem connecting my work, for instance, in Nicaragua with my work in Winooski.
I sure am. Okay.
I mean, it's another community. I mean, it's the same work. This is what it looked like out my window in 1972, where you have Bill's Diner. And this is what it looked like with the most recent development. I've been able to merge these two scenes, which are from the same place.
This collage commemorates the deluxe boarding house for men that had been demolished. On that exact site, there was now a large parking garage. This protests the F-35s coming to Winooski.
From Congo Brazzaville. This is Marie. Hello, Marie.
It was an all-day thing, but people came in at different times of the day. So you had the Vietnamese dancers would come in at 3 and they'd be gone by 4. And somebody might have come in for French discussion at 1 or something. And I made an individual picture of everyone who came during the day. And I think there's 117 layers in Photoshop. In a recent show, I decided to go back and look at some of the old photographs. So to take some of those images and gobble them up with color gradients was liberating. I love Central America. And the story of the buses dreaming was in Merida, Mexico. The picture of the Cristo Nos Habla, that's from north of Merida. The picture of Belize City was earlier, and that's from Belize, from one of those early trips.